The night it started to eat away at me, I stood by the kitchen window, watching the streetlights spill their weak amber glow across the sidewalk. Inside, the house was quiet, the kids upstairs. Ashley was in the living room, her face glowing faintly from the computer screen. She laughed. A soft, private sound. It wasn't just the laugh itself, it was the way it felt like a secret, a moment I wasn't part of. I leaned against the counter, pretending to fuss with my beer bottle, stealing glances at her through the doorway. Her back was to me, her shoulders slightly hunched as she typed, fingers moving quickly over the keyboard. A few months ago, I wouldn't have thought twice about it. But lately, Ashley had been pulling away not with loud arguments or slammed doors, but in quieter, more insidious ways. And I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. When she first suggested we buy the computer, I didn't love the idea. "Thomas," she'd said, her hand on my arm, her smile easy, "this isn't just for me. It's for the kids. For school projects. For research. We're just catching up with the times." I wasn't a Luddite exactly, but the idea of bringing this thing into our home unsettled me. Ashley loved it, though. She loved the way it connected her to the world, to people, to whoever. I thought it would be a phase, a new toy, like the bread machine she used obsessively for 3 weeks before stashing it in the garage. But this was different. It started small. Late-night emails to catch up on work. Quick phone calls where she lowered her voice just slightly when I walked into the room. At first, I chalked it up to her job at the real estate office. She was popular there, competent, friendly. Ashley had always been the kind of person people gravitated toward. But then I started noticing other things. The way she'd tilt her phone screen away from me when a notification popped up. The text she answered with a coy smile, her eyes darting up to make sure I wasn't watching. The way she lingered in her car after coming home from errands, sitting in the driveway for just a minute too long. I tried to tell myself it didn't mean anything. Until one night, I walked into the living room to say goodnight. She didn't hear me at first, too absorbed in the glowing screen. The sound of her typing stopped as I approached, and she clicked something away quickly, too quickly. "Who are you talking to?" I asked, trying to keep my voice light. "Oh," she said, startled. Her smile was tight, her eyes not quite meeting mine. "Just Jen from work." She needed help with something. I nodded, but I couldn't help noticing the way her hand hovered near the mouse, as if she were guarding it. "Everything okay?" I asked, standing behind her. "Yeah," she said, a little too quickly. Then, with that easy charm she always had, "Thomas, you're hovering. It's a little creepy." I forced a laugh and walked away, but something about the moment gnawed me. There was a sharpness to her tone that hadn't been there before, as if I'd intruded on something private. Something she didn't want me to see. The next morning, as she got ready for work, I caught her glancing at her phone, her lips curving into a faint, distracted smile. "What's so funny?" I asked, leaning against the doorframe. She said, looking up. Her voice was casual, but there was a flicker of something in her eyes. Surprise? Guilt? "Oh, just a meme Mark sent me." "Mark?" "Yeah, you know. My co-worker. The one I told you about." She turned back to her phone, dismissing me with a wave of her hand. "He's hilarious." Her tone was breezy, but the name stuck in my head. Mark. A harmless enough name, but the way she said it, light, familiar, almost affectionate. That night, I couldn't sleep. I lay there in the dark, the faint sound of her laughter from downstairs replaying in my mind. I couldn't remember the last time she'd laughed like that around me. Weeks passed, and the feeling only grew. She became more distant, more preoccupied. Family dinners turned into hurried meals where she barely looked up from her phone. When Ellie asked for help with homework, Ashley waved her off, saying she was swamped. And then, one night, I overheard a phone call. I wasn't trying to eavesdrop, I was getting a glass of water, but her voice carried through the kitchen door. It wasn't what she said that stopped me in my tracks, it was how she said it. Low, soft, intimate. "Of course I missed you," she said, her voice tinged with a smile. I froze. For a moment, I thought about barging in, demanding to know who she was talking to. But I didn't. Instead, I stood there in the dark, listening to her laugh, a sound that used to be mine. When she finally hung up, I crept back upstairs, my heart pounding. I lay awake for hours, staring at the ceiling, trying to piece together what was happening to my marriage. And for the first time, I wondered if Ashley had secrets she wasn't willing to share. I tried to dismiss the growing unease that gnawed at me every time I saw Ashley's face lit by the glow of the computer. I wanted to ignore the way her voice softened when she spoke to Mark, how her laughter became something I only heard from a distance. But the more I tried to push it out of my mind, the more it seeped in. Ashley was slipping away, slowly, imperceptibly. It wasn't like anything I could point to as a single moment of betrayal. It wasn't in the way she touched me or the way she looked at me, it was in the little things, the small signals that piled up until they couldn't be ignored anymore. The computer had become a fixture of our home, dominating our evenings. At first, I thought it was harmless. I figured she was just doing work for her job, or maybe she was keeping in touch with her friends. But there was something different about how she used it now. She wasn't simply answering emails or watching funny videos. She was lost in it. More than once, I caught her on the phone, speaking in hushed tones, stepping away as though trying to create a barrier between her words and my ears. "Just a work thing," she'd say when she returned. "Nothing to worry about." But I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. Her eyes would be bright, her cheeks flushed, as though she was sharing a joke that I wasn't part of. She used to tell me everything. She used to share those little moments of joy, her day at work, a conversation with a friend, something funny she'd read online. Now, she kept it all to herself. The distance between us became more obvious. It wasn't a physical thing, not exactly. She still came to bed with me, still kissed me goodnight, still played the part of the loving wife. But I could sense the emotional distance. It was as if there was a wall between us, one built from late-night phone calls, cryptic text messages, and a computer that felt more like an ally than I did. One evening, I returned home early from a meeting. I'd planned to surprise her with dinner, to remind her of the things we used to enjoy. But when I walked through the door, the house was quieter than usual. I heard the low hum of the computer, saw her at the desk with her back turned to me. "Hey," I said, stepping into the room. She didn't hear me at first. When she turned, her expression was quick to mask itself. "Oh, hi, Thomas. You're home early," she said, her voice a little too bright. I tried to ignore the nagging sense that something was wrong. I set the takeout bag down on the kitchen counter, watching as her eyes flicked back to the screen. I couldn't see what she was typing, but the energy in the room had shifted. "I thought we could have a quiet night," I said, pushing past the unease I felt. "Just us. The kids are out at their friend's house. I thought we could catch up." She hesitated for a moment. "I don't know, Thomas. I've got some things to wrap up here. Maybe later?" Her answer was polite, almost dismissive. It wasn't the first time she had suggested later. The word tasted sour in my mouth. "All right," I said, forcing a smile. I grabbed a beer from the fridge and took a long swallow, feeling the cool liquid burn down my throat. The taste didn't help. It was like I was drowning in the tension between us, but I didn't know how to break through it. A little later, I found myself alone in the living room, flipping through channels. It was one of those nights where everything felt off, like I was watching someone else's life through a foggy window. I could hear Ashley typing again, her fingers quick, her body tense. And then came the phone again. I sat in silence, the low murmur of her voice carried down the hall. There was something intimate in the way she spoke, something soft and secret. It was like she had slipped away to another world, and I was no longer part of it. This time, I couldn't take it anymore. I stood up and walked down the hall, my heart pounding in my chest. I stopped outside the door to the room where she sat. My hand rested on the doorframe, and I listened for a moment. She was laughing. It was a low, throaty laugh. The kind she used to share with me in private moments, when the world felt safe, when it was just the two of us. But this laugh, it wasn't for me. It was for him. I didn't knock. I couldn't bring myself to. Instead, I pushed the door open, my breath heavy. Ashley turned quickly, her face flushing, her fingers still on the keyboard. The phone was in her hand, and she quickly shoved it in her pocket as though trying to hide it. "What's going on?" I asked, my voice a little too sharp. "Nothing," she said quickly, standing up. Her voice was steady, but her eyes betrayed her. There was an awkwardness between us now, one that had never been there before. "Who was that?" I asked, my patience slipping. "Just Mark," she said, her voice trailing off. "Just Mark," I repeated, trying to make sense of it. The name felt strange on my tongue. "What's going on, Ashley? What's really going on?" She didn't answer at first. Her eyes darted to the computer screen, then back to me. For a second, I saw something, a flicker of guilt. Then she was back to herself, the mask slipping into place. "Nothing, Thomas. You're overreacting." "It's nothing," she said, but her voice trembled at the edges. The words hit me harder than I expected. It wasn't just the rejection. It was the quiet realization that I had been living in a house of lies. I had been blind, unable or unwilling to see what was happening under my nose. And now it was too late. When you don't want to know the truth, you'll go to extraordinary lengths to avoid it. I'd always thought of myself as a man who faced problems head-on, but when it came to Ashley, I hesitated. I didn't want to see what was right in front of me because acknowledging it would mean my life, the life we'd built, was a lie. But the truth doesn't stay buried forever. It was a rainy Thursday when everything unraveled. I came home early again, the soft patter of rain on the roof a soothing backdrop to my thoughts. The kids were at Ellie's ballet recital, and Ashley had said she'd catch up on some work at home. I didn't think much of it as I walked through the door. The house smelled of her lavender candle, the one she always lit when she wanted to relax. I hung up my coat, set my keys on the counter, and called out, "Ash?" Her response was delayed. "In here." Her voice came from the living room, and when I stepped in, she was at the computer again, her body angled away from the screen. I caught a glimpse of a message window before she quickly clicked it closed. "Oh, you're home early," she said, turning to me with a strained smile. "Yeah," I said slowly, watching her closely. Her cheeks were flushed, her hair a little messy, as if she'd been pulling at it absent-mindedly. She stood up quickly, almost too quickly, blocking the computer with her body. "Did you eat? I can heat up something if you're hungry." Her voice was casual, but her movements weren't. "No, I'm good," I said, not taking my eyes off her. There was a tension in the air, a crackling unease that made the room feel smaller. Ashley fidgeted, smoothing the front of her sweater as she moved to the kitchen. I stood there for a moment, staring at the computer. And then, for reasons I still can't fully explain, I sat down. The screen had gone dark, but when I moved the mouse, it woke up. A message window blinked at me, open to a conversation that hadn't yet been erased. I knew I shouldn't look. Whatever was there would change things forever. But my hand moved on its own, scrolling through the messages. The words hit me like a fist to the gut. "Mark, can't stop thinking about last night. You looked so beautiful. Wish I could have stayed longer. Ashley, you're too sweet. I keep replaying it in my mind. I needed that. You have no idea how much." My breath caught in my throat. My eyes scanned the rest of the conversation, each line slicing through me like a blade. There was no ambiguity, no way to explain it away. These weren't the words of colleagues or friends. They were lovers. I felt like I was drowning. My head spun, my hands gripping the desk so tightly my knuckles turned white. Every memory of Ashley, the way she laughed, the way she kissed me goodnight, the way she held our children, came rushing back, now tainted by this. "What are you doing?" Her voice was sharp, almost panicked. I hadn't heard her come back into the room. I turned to face her, and for a moment, we just stared at each other. The color drained from her face when she saw the screen. "You tell me," I said, my voice low, barely controlled. She opened her mouth to speak, but no words came out. Her eyes darted between me and the computer, as if searching for an explanation that didn't exist. "It's not what it looks like," she said finally, her voice trembling. I laughed bitterly, the sound hollow in the silence. "Really? Then tell me what it is, Ashley. Because from where I'm sitting, it looks like you've been screwing around with your coworker while I've been at work, while I've been raising our kids." Her mouth tightened, her hands wringing together as she took a step toward me. "Thomas, it's not serious. It's just..." "Don't," I snapped, cutting her off. Don't you dare minimize this. Don't stand there and tell me it's just anything. I read it. I saw it. Don't lie to me. She flinched, tears welling in her eyes. I didn't mean for this to happen. I swear, I didn't. But things have been so hard between us. You're always busy, always working. I felt so alone. Her words hit me like a slap. Alone? I echoed, my voice rising. You think I haven't felt alone? I've been here, Ashley. I've been trying. But you? You've been sneaking around behind my back, lying to me, lying to our kids. She crumpled onto the couch, her hands covering her face as she sobbed. I'm sorry. I'm so sorry, Thomas. I never wanted to hurt you. I stood there, frozen, the weight of her words pressing down on me. My anger burned hot, but beneath it, there was something worse, a hollow, aching pain that threatened to consume me. Is it over? I asked finally, my voice cold and distant. She looked up at me, her face streaked with tears. Yes, she said quickly. It's over. It meant nothing. I swear to you, it's done. But I didn't believe her. How could I? The moment Ashley's confession left her lips, something inside me snapped. The love, trust, and years of memories we had built together were swallowed by a tidal wave of rage. Before I knew it, the words had escaped my mouth, cutting through her sobs like a blade. Get out. Her head jerked up, her tear-streaked face frozen in shock. What? I said, get out, I repeated, my voice rising. Out of my house. Now. Thomas, please, she begged, her voice trembling as she stood, clutching at my arm. I shook her off, stepping back as if her touch burned me. Don't touch me. Don't talk to me. Just leave. Where am I supposed to go? She asked, her voice breaking. I don't have anywhere to. I don't care. I shouted, my words laced with venom. You didn't think about that when you were sneaking around with him, did you? Call Mark. I'm sure he'll be happy to pick you up. She flinched at his name, and for a moment, I thought she might argue. But instead, she nodded numbly, her shoulders slumping as she reached for her coat. Her hands shook as she fumbled with the zipper, her tears falling in silent streams. I'm sorry, she whispered, her voice cracking under the weight of her guilt. I never wanted to hurt you. Save it, I said coldly, pointing toward the door. Just go. She hesitated, her eyes searching mine for something, mercy, forgiveness, a flicker of the man who used to love her. But I had nothing left to give. After what felt like an eternity, she opened the door and stepped out into the cold night. When the door closed behind her, the silence hit me like a freight train. I stood there for a long time, staring at the spot where she had been. My anger burned white-hot, but underneath it was something worse, a hollow ache that spread through my chest, threatening to consume me. I sat on the couch, my head in my hands, trying to make sense of what had just happened. The woman I had trusted with my life, the mother of my children, had betrayed me in the most intimate way possible. And now, she was gone. The hours dragged on, the weight of my decision settling over me like a lead blanket. I thought of Zach and Ellie, the questions they would ask, the pain they would feel when they realized their family was broken. I thought of Ashley, out there somewhere, alone. And as much as I wanted to hate her, a part of me couldn't. By the time the first light of dawn crept through the windows, the anger had begun to ebb, replaced by exhaustion and an overwhelming sense of loss. I grabbed my phone, staring at her contact name for what felt like an eternity before finally pressing call. It rang twice before she picked up. Thomas? Her voice was shaky, hesitant. Come back, I said, the words heavy in my throat. What? She asked, her voice barely above a whisper. You need to come back, I repeated, my tone flat. The kids will be home tomorrow, and they can't wake up to this. I don't know what to say, she stammered. Don't say anything, I cut her off. Just come back. We'll deal with this later. There was a long pause, and I could hear her sniffling on the other end. Okay, she said finally. An hour later, her car pulled into the driveway. I sat on the couch, not moving as she entered. She stood in the doorway, clutching her coat tightly around her, her eyes puffy and red. Thomas, she began, her voice trembling. You can sleep in the guest room, I said, cutting her off. I'll take the couch. She nodded silently, her steps hesitant as she made her way down the hall. The sound of the guest room door closing felt like the final punctuation on a chapter of our lives I never wanted to read again. That night, I didn't sleep. I stared at the ceiling, replaying every moment of our marriage in my mind. The love, the laughter, the promises, all of it felt so distant now, buried under the weight of her betrayal. I didn't know what the future held. I didn't know if forgiveness was possible or even if I wanted it to be. But for now, all I could do was survive the night and face whatever came next. The morning after Ashley came back was heavy with silence. The kind that stretches and smothers, or even the smallest noise feels like a betrayal of the quiet. I sat at the kitchen table nursing a cup of coffee that had gone cold long ago. My mind churned with thoughts I couldn't untangle, while the smell of rain lingered from the night before. Ashley emerged from the guest room, her hair a tangled mess, her face pale and puffy. She paused at the doorway, hesitant, like a stranger in her own home. When our eyes met, I saw the guilt there, the silent apology she had repeated over and over in her mind. Morning, she said softly, her voice tentative. I didn't reply. Instead, I gestured to the pot of coffee on the counter, then turned my gaze back to the mug in my hands. She moved quietly, pouring herself a cup, before sitting across from me. The table between us felt like a chasm. For a long time, neither of us spoke. I want to say something, she finally said, her voice trembling. I know. I know I don't deserve to ask for anything. I know I've hurt you in ways I can't take back. But Thomas, Stop, I interrupted, holding up a hand. Not now. I can't do this right now. Her face fell, and she nodded, her hands gripping the mug as if it were the only thing keeping her grounded. The kids were coming home that afternoon, and the thought of facing them filled me with dread. How could I look at them, knowing the family they trusted was cracking beneath the surface? How could I explain something I didn't fully understand myself? I spent the morning busying myself with tasks that didn't need doing, reorganizing the garage, folding towels that were already folded. Anything to keep my mind off Ashley's presence, the weight of her betrayal pressing against my chest like a stone. When Zach and Ellie came through the door, their laughter filled the house, cutting through the suffocating tension like sunlight breaking through storm clouds. They dropped their bags and ran to hug me, their faces lit with the joy of being home. Ashley appeared in the doorway, her smile tentative but hopeful. Hey, you two, she said, her voice warm and steady in a way I hadn't heard in weeks. Mom! Ellie shouted, running to her. Ashley crouched down, wrapping her in a tight hug, her eyes glassy with unshed tears. Zach gave her a quick hug too, but then turned to me, his brow furrowed. Dad, is everything okay? He asked, his voice tinged with concern. I forced a smile, patting him on the shoulder. Yeah, buddy. Everything's fine. But he didn't look convinced. That night, after the kids had gone to bed, the silence returned. Ashley sat on the couch, her hands clasped in her lap, while I stood near the window, staring out into the darkness. We need to talk, she said softly, breaking the silence. I don't know if I'm ready for that, I replied, my voice heavy. Thomas, please, she said, her tone pleading. I need to tell you the truth. About everything. I turned to face her, my arms crossed over my chest. All right. Talk. She swallowed hard, her hands trembling as she began. It wasn't supposed to happen. I never meant for it to go this far. At first, it was just, I don't know, a distraction. Someone to talk to when I felt alone. You were lonely? I asked, my voice sharp. In a house full of people who love you, you were lonely? Tears filled her eyes, and she nodded. I know it doesn't make sense. But I felt invisible, Thomas. Like I was just a wife, a mom, someone who was there to keep everything running. And Mark, he noticed me. He made me feel like I mattered. Her words cut deep, but I forced myself to listen. It started with messages, she continued. Then lunches. It wasn't physical at first. But then, one night, after a work event, her voice broke, and she looked down at her lap, unable to meet my eyes. I clenched my fists, fighting the anger that bubbled just beneath the surface. And what about now? Is it over? Yes, she said quickly, looking up at me. I ended it. I told him it was a mistake, that I couldn't keep doing this. I swear to you, Thomas, it's over. I turned away, staring out the window again. The night was quiet, the stars barely visible through the haze of the city. Do you have any idea what you've done? I asked, my voice low but firm. Do you know what this has done to me? To us? I know, she whispered. And I'll do whatever it takes to fix it. Therapy, counseling, whatever you want. I just need a chance to make this right. I didn't respond. I couldn't. That night, I slept in the guest room, unable to face the bed we had shared for so many years. The road ahead felt impossibly long, the wounds too fresh to even consider healing. But for the sake of Zach and Ellie, for the family we had built, I knew I had to try. The weeks that followed Ashley's confession were a blur of tense silences and awkward conversations. We went through the motions of daily life for the kids, but behind closed doors, the fractures in our marriage widened. I found solace in the mundane work, errands, anything that kept my mind occupied. But no matter how busy I kept myself, the anger and betrayal lingered like a storm cloud, always ready to break. It was during this time that I met Rachel. Rachel was the attorney I had hired to help me understand my legal options. The thought of divorce had loomed in my mind ever since that night, but I hadn't made a decision. Still, I needed to know what I might face if I chose to end things. She worked in a modest office downtown, her walls lined with degrees and framed newspaper clippings about her victories in court. When she greeted me in the waiting room, I noticed something in her demeanor, a quiet strength, a professionalism that made me feel like I was in good hands. Mr. Harper, she said, extending her hand. Thomas, I replied, shaking it firmly. Her handshake was warm but confident. She gestured for me to follow her into her office, where she motioned to a leather chair across from her desk. So, she began, sitting down and pulling out a notepad. What can I do for you today? I hesitated, unsure of how to start. The words felt foreign in my mouth, like saying them out loud would make everything too real. But I forced myself to speak. My wife, I began, my voice tight. She cheated. And I don't know if I can move past it. Rachel didn't flinch. She nodded, her pen poised over the notepad. I'm sorry to hear that, she said softly. Infidelity is one of the hardest things a marriage can endure. Are you considering divorce? I don't know, I admitted. I'm here because I need to understand my options. For me. For my kids. She nodded again, her expression compassionate but focused. Of course. Let's start by going over the basics. For the next hour, she walked me through the potential outcomes, custody arrangements, property division, the emotional toll of the process. Her voice was calm and steady, and for the first time in weeks, I felt like I had some semblance of control. As the meeting ended, Rachel set down her pen and leaned forward slightly. Thomas, she said, her tone softer now, whatever you decide, it's important to take care of yourself. This kind of pain, it doesn't go away overnight. You don't have to make any decisions right now. Give yourself time. I nodded, unable to find the words to thank her. Over the next few weeks, Rachel became more than just my attorney. She was someone I could talk to, someone who understood the depth of my pain without judgment. Her professionalism never wavered, but there was a kindness beneath it that made me feel seen in a way I hadn't in a long time. During one of our meetings, she shared something personal. My ex-husband cheated on me, she said, her voice steady but tinged with sadness. It broke me in ways I didn't think were possible. But eventually, I found my way back. Her words hit me harder than I expected. How? I asked, genuinely curious. How did you move on? It wasn't easy, she admitted. It took time. Therapy helped. Friends. But mostly, I had to stop blaming myself for his choices. I realized his betrayal said more about him than it did about me. Her honesty stirred something in me, a flicker of hope that maybe, just maybe, I could survive this too. Our professional relationship gradually bled into something deeper. After a particularly tough meeting, Rachel suggested grabbing coffee. What started as a casual invitation became a regular occurrence. We talked about everything: work, life, our shared experiences with betrayal. She had a way of listening that made me feel lighter, like the weight I'd been carrying wasn't mine alone anymore. And slowly, I began to realize how much I looked forward to seeing her. But guilt lingered in the background. I was still married, still tethered to Ashley by a fragile thread. I couldn't deny the spark that had started to grow between Rachel and me, but I wasn't ready to act on it. One night, after another strained dinner with Ashley and the kids, I sat in my car outside Rachel's office, debating whether to go in. I had no meeting scheduled, no reason to be there. But I wanted to see her, to hear her voice, to feel that fleeting sense of normalcy she gave me. Before I could second-guess myself, I walked in. Rachel was sitting at her desk, her head bent over a file. When she looked up and saw me, her expression shifted to one of quiet concern. "Thomas," she said, setting the file aside. "What's wrong?" I sat down across from her, running a hand through my hair. "I don't know," I admitted. "I just needed to talk to someone." Her gaze softened, and she leaned forward slightly. "I'm here," she said simply. In that moment, I felt something crack open inside me, the flood of emotions I'd been holding back for so long. And for the first time since Ashley's betrayal, I allowed myself to feel something other than anger and pain. Months passed, and the tangled web of my life began to shift. My days no longer revolved around pain but around progress. Ashley and I had reached an unspoken truce for the sake of the kids, but the bond between us was fractured beyond repair. Meanwhile, my connection with Rachel deepened, evolving from quiet conversations over coffee to something neither of us could ignore. She was unlike anyone I'd ever known, steadfast, compassionate, unafraid to confront the broken parts of me. Rachel wasn't just helping me pick up the pieces, she was helping me see the man I could be beyond the wreckage of my marriage. One evening, after we'd spent hours talking in her modest apartment, I found myself blurting out words I hadn't planned to say. "I don't know where I'd be without you, Rachel," I admitted, my voice raw. "You've been my anchor through all of this." She smiled softly, her gaze steady. "You're stronger than you think, Thomas. I've just been here to remind you of that." It wasn't long after that our relationship shifted again, from friendship to something more profound. Our first kiss was tentative, hesitant, but it held a promise, a second chance at happiness for both of us. As our relationship grew, Rachel began to open up about her own past. She told me about her father, a man who had been imprisoned for most of her life. "He made a lot of mistakes," she said one night as we sat on her couch, her head resting on my shoulder. "But he's still my dad. I visit him when I can, though it's been years since I've been able to look at him without feeling complicated." Her vulnerability only made me love her more. And when I asked her to marry me on a crisp autumn morning, her answer came with tears and a whispered yes. But Rachel had one condition. "If we're going to do this, Thomas," she said, her voice shaking slightly, "I need my dad to be there. Even if it's unconventional." At first, her request caught me off guard. But the more I thought about it, the more it made sense. This wasn't just about us, it was about healing, about creating something new out of the ruins of our pasts. So, we decided to hold the wedding in the prison chapel where her father was serving his sentence. When the day arrived, I could feel the weight of the moment as we stepped through the heavy steel gates, the guards leading us through sterile corridors to the chapel. Rachel squeezed my hand tightly, her face pale but determined. Inside, the chapel was modest wooden pews, a small altar, sunlight streaming through narrow windows. It wasn't what I had envisioned for our wedding, but it felt right. When Rachel's father entered, escorted by a guard, her breath hitched. He was older than I'd imagined, his face lined with years of regret, but his eyes lit up when he saw her. "Rachel," he said softly, his voice trembling. She ran to him, wrapping her arms around his frail frame. For a moment, it was just the two of them, a reunion long overdue. The ceremony itself was simple, attended only by a few close friends and family. Amy was there, sitting beside Zach and Ellie, who watched with wide-eyed curiosity. Ashley had stayed home, a choice I was grateful for. As Rachel and I exchanged vows, I felt a sense of peace I hadn't known in years. This wasn't the life I had planned, but it was the life I had fought for, the life I had earned. After the ceremony, Rachel's father pulled me aside. "Thank you," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "For loving her. For giving her a future." I didn't have the words to reply, so I simply nodded, clasping his hand firmly. When we left the prison that day, Rachel's face was radiant, her hand warm in mine. We had found something beautiful in the unlikeliest of places, a love that was forged in pain but tempered by hope. As we drove home, Zach and Ellie chattered excitedly in the back seat, their laughter filling the car. For the first time in what felt like forever, I felt whole. Life didn't magically fix itself after the wedding, but for the first time in years, I felt like I was moving forward. Rachel and I settled into a quiet rhythm, blending our lives in ways that felt natural and unforced. The kids adapted surprisingly well. Zach, ever the observant one, seemed to sense the peace Rachel brought into my life. He asked questions at first about why Ashley and I didn't work out and how Rachel fit into our family now, but over time, he seemed to accept her presence. Ellie, still young enough to live in a world of simplicity, embraced Rachel with open arms, enamored by her warmth and patience. Ashley, however, remained a ghost in the periphery. We shared custody of the kids, exchanging polite words at drop-offs and pickups, but there was a lingering tension that neither of us could fully shake. She tried to bridge the gap a few times, sending long-winded texts about her regrets or asking if I'd ever truly forgive her. I never responded. Forgiveness wasn't something I could give her, not completely. But I didn't hate her anymore either. Over time, the sharp edges of my anger dulled, leaving behind a quiet resignation. She had made her choices, and I had made mine. Rachel, in her quiet way, helped me navigate those waters. She never pushed me to feel things I wasn't ready for, but she always offered perspective when I needed it. Forgiveness doesn't mean forgetting, Thomas, she said one night as we sat on the porch, the kids playing in the yard. It just means letting go of the power the past has over you. I thought about those words often, especially when the pain resurfaced unexpectedly, like a wound that hadn't fully healed. In the months that followed, our home became a place of healing. Rachel and I worked together to create an environment where the kids could thrive. She was a natural with them, helping Ellie with her school projects, listening to Zach's endless stories about his favorite sports teams. For me, the real turning point came one quiet evening after dinner. Zach and I were in the living room, playing a board game, while Ellie was upstairs reading. Rachel sat on the couch, her laptop open as she worked on a case. It was a simple scene, but as I looked around, I realized something I hadn't felt in a long time: contentment. Later that night, as Rachel and I lay in bed, I found myself speaking words I hadn't said to anyone, not even her. I was scared I'd never feel happy again, I admitted, my voice barely above a whisper. After everything that happened, I didn't think it was possible. Rachel turned to me, her eyes soft and full of understanding. Happiness doesn't look the way we think it will, she said. It's not always perfect. It's messy and complicated and worth fighting for. She was right. The journey wasn't easy, but it brought us to a place where love wasn't just an abstract idea but a daily choice, a commitment to building something stronger than the pain that had come before. A year after our wedding, Rachel surprised me with news I hadn't expected: she was pregnant. The joy in her eyes when she told me was contagious, and for the first time, I allowed myself to believe that our family's future could truly be brighter than its past. When our daughter was born, Zach and Ellie were ecstatic, doting on their baby sister like she was the center of their world. Our home, once a place of tension and unspoken hurt, became filled with laughter and love. I'd learned something through all of this: pain doesn't define us. It shapes us, sure, but it's what we do with that pain that matters. Rachel and I built a life together, not in spite of our scars, but because of them. And as I stood in the kitchen one evening, watching my wife rock our baby to sleep while Zach and Ellie played cards at the table, I realized something: I had found my haven. It wasn't perfect, and it never would be, but it was ours. And that was enough. Do you think Thomas made the right decision in throwing Ashley out, even temporarily? Why or why not? Do you believe in the concept of a second chance at love, even after such deep wounds? Why or why not? If you were in Thomas's position, would you have been able to forgive Ashley? Why or why not?